Hi, welcome back to another episode of Stand on Guard. This is our live coverage of question period. As I say, all the answers for question period, all the answers to question period. I'm your host, David Gray. Thanks for joining me today. I've got a video to show you in a while on some hijinks going on at the Heritage Committee. You might have seen my story in the Post Millennial about how the president and CEO of CBC, one Catherine Tate, has been invited to address and answer some questions from the Heritage Committee. So interesting stuff going on here. Interesting stuff going on. And of course, the committee looking into whether or not Greg Fergus should resign as speaker. I have an interesting anecdote to share, and I want to bring that to your attention very, very shortly here.
Oral questions, questions orales.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. When the Prime Minister inflates the price of groceries and forces 28,000 young Quebecers to write to Santa Claus for food rather than presents, he spends $1 billion on a scandalous green fund, the officials of which are saying that money is thrown for free to friends and wasted. And now a whistleblower said, and I quote, that the minister lied to the committee about this scandal. Why did this minister hide the scandal? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader's plan that seeks to close Parliament last week failed. All it served to do was show the true colours of the Conservatives. It cost $2 million to Canadian taxpayers. The Conservative Party tried to reduce access to affordable childcare services, reduce the construction of affordable housing, and cut in the budgets of policing and military bodies. They want to bring us back to the Stone Age. We, on our side, will meet the needs of Canadians. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the question was about the Prime Minister's $1 billion green slush fund scandal. We already know while he forces 2 million Canadians to a food bank and doubled housing costs, is quadrupling the carbon tax, he has $1 billion fund that whose own bureaucrats say reminds them of the sponsorship scandal, whose executives give money to their own companies. Yesterday, a courageous whistleblower testified the Prime Minister's Innovation Minister lied, and I quote, lied to the committee. Why is this minister and his boss, the Prime Minister, covering up this scandal and waste of Canadian tax dollars?
Well, they're on a good one here, aren't they?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Yes.
It's not surprising that the Conservative leader doesn't want to talk about his failed Republican-style plan to shut down
Here we go.
Parliament last week.
Republican
All
style.
his 30-hour temper tantrum achieved was to show Canadians the party's true colors and cost Canadians $2 million in tax wasteful spending. The Conservative Party tried to cut affordable childcare, cut construction of affordable housing, and defund the police and
Speaker, you're probably not aware of that, but late last night,
Inflation in 40 years, and we have 2 million Canadians, a record-smashing number, lined up at food banks. I know the Prime Minister is desperate to avoid defending his own track record, or worse yet, his quadrupling of the carbon tax. There is a common-sense Conservative bill, C-234, in the Senate, up for the vote today. Will the Prime Minister stop blocking the bill, axe the tax so that our farmers can feed families?
And we know Trudeau's been intimidating these senators who say they're not really liberal.
Party of Canada had the opportunity to support affordability measures for Canadians, but instead they chose to take 30 hours attacking the most vulnerable. During the Conservative leader's $2 million temper tantrum, they gladly stood against veterans experiencing homelessness, against emergency shelters for women and girls, against Indigenous housing, against rapid affordable housing construction. They even tried to prevent support for those who lost their homes in Hurricane Fiona. That leader is reckless and should be ashamed.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, you can see he just got his script about 5 minutes before he walked into question
Not
period.
spending money on any of those things. He has a food program that doesn't feed kids, it feeds bureaucracies and creates frameworks that kids can't eat. He has a housing affordability program that doubles the cost of housing, a housing accelerator that hasn't built a single house, a carbon tax that hasn't reduced emissions. So instead of spending billions on programs that cause inflation and do nothing but sound pretty, why won't he axe the tax on our farmers so that they can feed Canadians this winter?
Because he doesn't want to feed
Right
Canadians.
Honourable Prime
Quite
Minister.
obvious.
Whether the leader of the opposition makes a homemade video about it or not, a key factor contributing to food inflation around the world is Putin's illegal war in Ukraine.
What a lot of
Party
dunk.
has been playing right into the Kremlin's hands.
Gonna
by
play the
voting
Ukraine
against
card today, are we? You
Operation
half-wit.
Unifier, by voting against funding for military aid to Ukraine, and by voting at every opportunity, including again this morning, against the Canada-U-Trade free
Good.
trade agreement that Ukrainians
Not a cent
have been
more.
asking for. We
Not
will
a
never
cent
abandon
more.
Ukraine, unlike the Conservative leader who showed Canadians.
It's not a cent more from taxpayers to Ukraine. The war is over.
The Honourable
It's a
Leader of the
bottomless
Opposition.
pit of corruption.
The Prime Minister is desperate to distract
Desperate.
from the misery that he caused here at home. I wonder if he could just for once think about Canadians instead of thinking about himself. We have 2 million Canadians lined up in food banks, a record-smashing number. He's doubled the cost of housing. He wants to quadruple the carbon tax. 9 in 10 young people say they'll never be able to afford a home. We understand with this miserable record, he doesn't want to talk about Canada or Canadians. He'd rather spread falsehood about faraway foreign lands, Mr. Speaker. Will he not stand up for once for Canada, axe the tax so our families can eat?
The Right
You know he
Honourable
won't.
Prime Minister.
What red herrings you gonna throw out now?
Conservative leaders' partisan vitriol and performance games are hurting Canadians. Let's talk about their record directly. When it came to 988, the suicide crisis helpline, how did they just
You're the
vote
one
to
encouraging the
against?
suicide
When it
with your
came to the
euthanasia
Migos
program.
Rail bypass, how did they vote against? Against. When it came to the new Montreal Holocaust Museum on the first night of Hanukkah, how did they vote? Against. Mr. Speaker, there is clearly nothing this Conservative leader won't compromise.
You bloody hypocrite, you black-faced hypocrite. He is an atrocity.
Alors?
Order.
Oh, shut up. Who takes the speaker seriously anymore? He's lost his credibility. He's a joke. I'm sure, hey, folks who are watching today, I haven't put the comments on. Thanks everybody
The
for
Honourable
commenting.
Member for Belleau-Chambly.
Anyone take this guy seriously out there? Can you take the speaker seriously? I doubt it.
I
No.
sought to understand the government's new dental program. It's not an easy one. We have 3 types
All right,
of
I want to
dental
show you guys a
programs.
video
A private one for the
that I think you're going to like.
Speaker, you're probably not aware of that, but late last night, many members of PROC received letters supporting you in your role as Speaker.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Duncan.
Wondering, just in reference to Ms. Romanato's comments about, she referenced some emails that we received last night, including the members of PROC's personal parliamentary emails. I'm looking for unanimous consent if I could table those 2 letters that were provided to us by email last night, and also including in that a copy of the metadata from both of those. When you open up the Microsoft Word document, you could actually go and see who the original authors of those two were. I'd like to table not only the letters, but along with each, that the author of the one letter dated yesterday came from a Liberal appointed senator, Senator Andrew Cardozo. And I'd also on the second letter like to table not only the letter, but the mega data that shows that the author of that original letter was a former Liberal member of Parliament, Frank Baylis.
Because we will be here to help them. That is something that counts for all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we will be here for them, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, to date, 20,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed in Gaza, half of whom are women and children. Despite this, the Liberals and the Conservatives refuse to demand a ceasefire. It's revolting. It's inhuman.
Okay, sorry about the sound being off there. I hope you had a chance to watch that video. It, I think, is very telling because it shows how anonymous letters that were delivered to the committee investigating whether or not Greg Fergus should stay as Speaker were in fact written by a former Liberal MP and a Liberal appointed senator. So my apologies, the sound was off there when I'm going back and forth. I'm doing all the technical stuff today. And sometimes I get around the bend here. Back to question period. I'll have more to say on this later. My apologies again for the sound.
Can work and live safely in recognized countries. We will do everything in our power to continue to make sure that Canadians agree with one another, see eye to eye so we don't see hatred, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. This government will continue to be here for everyone.
The Honourable Member from Edmonton Strathcona.
The Liberal position is appalling, not responsible. For 2 months, this government has sat and watched while 18,000 innocent civilians have lost their lives and have refused to call for a ceasefire. We need a ceasefire. We need the hostages removed. Last week, it was reported that Liberal donors were withholding support because of the moral failure of the Liberals. Today, there is an important vote at the United Nations. The Liberals have failed to listen to the Palestinian people and to Canadian Palestinians. Will they at least listen to their fundraisers and vote for a ceasefire today?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, since October 7th, we have recognized the terrorist attack by Hamas that killed well over 1,000 innocent Israelis, and we have recognized Israel's right to defend itself. But at the same time, the cost of justice cannot be the continued suffering of all Palestinian civilians. That is why we're continuing to put forward, including today in a statement with Australia and New Zealand, a strong and clear Canadian position that we will continue to work with allies around the world on moving towards a two-state solution with peace for Israelis and peace for Palestinians living side by side.
The Honourable Member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
There's been explosive testimony by a whistleblower on this Prime Minister's $1 billion green slush fund
that's seen $150 million misappropriated and gone to Liberal insiders. And senior NDP Liberal government officials have said there is no plan to get Canadians back their missing millions. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, it's clear that he's not worth that cost, and probably why he wouldn't even stick around. Will the Prime Minister shut down the slush fund and get Canadians back their money?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, it is shocking but not surprising to see the conservative ideology in full display, Mr. Speaker. Now what you're saying, Mr. Speaker, is that the conservative are willing to attack anyone and any institution that would fight for climate change, Mr. Speaker, even institutions that have been voted by the Parliament in 2001, Mr. Speaker. Now what the conservative are doing, they're calling the integrity into question of one of the top accounting firm in this country, Mr. Speaker. We will fight for Canadians, we will fight for climate change, and we'll restore governance.
Must all be misinformation, eh? Champagne, your cork is popped again.
On this side of the House, what we're doing is fighting Liberal corruption. We're going to keep doing that, even though this minister and his chief of staff, though they say it didn't happen, were briefed on what was going on at SCTC, but it was done orally so that they wouldn't be subject to ATIP rules. It's $150 missing million given outside the funding agreement, and we have 2 Liberal appointed board members who are under investigation by the Ethics Commissioner. We have an Auditor General investigation, and we have whistleblowers blowing the lid off this thing that shows that this minister and that Prime Minister don't have the courage to fight for Canadian tax dollars. Where are the missing millions? Who got rich?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Oh, not champagne again. On this side of the House.
Mr. Speaker, let's be very clear. What you're saying again, and for Canadians which are watching at home, don't be fooled. You're saying conservative ideology to fight against anyone, any institution, even those they voted for in 2001, Mr. Speaker, to create in this House an institution that would fight for climate change, Mr. Speaker. We suspended the funding of the organization. We called for an investigation. The leadership has resigned. We'll get to the bottom of this, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, I love this comment here.
The Honourable Member from South Shore, St. Margaret's.
So we're not missing anything.
Tell us which Liberals got rich, and government officials last night admitted they were in every single board meeting where this happened in the Liberal Green Slush Fund. And according to the whistleblower, the former chair and directors
we're not getting to the bottom of this at all.
$150 million of taxpayer money to their own companies. They were present, government officials were present during these meetings and allowed it to happen. So I'll ask the minister, why didn't he fire these corrupt Liberal directors?
I love this comment from Alice. They give free dental to kids and the elderly for $13 billion. Both groups have no teeth. Another Liberal scam to steal money. Now that's funny.
Agency does for communities, for not-for-profits, for businesses.
Oh, this is the woman who said you want your carbon tax exemption, vote Liberal. There she is.
So what's he going to say to the people of?
How can she stand up in the House of Commons without a bag over her head? Disgraceful.
I'm going to tell them we have your back.
You haven't got anybody's back.
Well, it's just not good enough that they won't deal with Liberal corruption at the Green Liberal Slush Fund. In fact, the minister took 35 months under his watch to suspend the Green Slush Fund when his own officials were in the meeting. And the whistleblower testified last night that the chair of the Green Slush Fund tried to get $2.2 million from the fund into her own vanity project, the Annette Basharian Center, a direct conflict of interest. Since industry officials were in the meeting, why did the minister not fire this Liberal corrupt director the minute that happened?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, we will take no lessons from the conservative, Mr.
There he is.
Speaker. Just last week, Canadians have seen
My God, he's been up far too much today.
They have voted against funding for affordable child care in this country, Mr. Speaker. They voted to cut Canadian dental care program, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we'll stand for Canadian. We'll stand.
Oh, shut up for a while. You know, here's the thing on dental care. Look at the mess the government has made out of Medicare. 65, 70,000 Canadians every year go to the United States for healthcare, for operations. They can't get in Canada because the waiting list is so long, they will have died by the time they get the operation. And we're paying $12,000 minimum per family for this so-called free Medicare. So what makes you think Dentacare is going to work? It's a disaster.
Can the Prime Minister let us know when we will get reimbursed for all this? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Oh, no.
The Conservatives' favourite thing to do is to chop, chop, chop. Think about it, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Conservative leader told his caucus, his extreme right caucus, to cut in the funding of search and rescue budgets. The Coast Guard that saves lives. 120 times the Conservatives have gone against Canadian values recently. Shame on them. The Honourable Member for
Oh, you
Legal
had your
TPR.
moment in the sun today, lady.
Mr. Speaker, this costly NDP Liberal government learnt in May that Liberal friends that they had appointed to the Green Slush Fund had filled their pockets for their own interests. And what did the minister do? Absolutely nothing. Even worse, the minister, and I quote, lied according to a whistleblower before committee. He did nothing and more money.
Comment from Karina Mitchell. Champagne Liberals have never stood up for Canadians. It's always Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Yes, we can't give them enough. More billions coming. And the United States, of course, is being lobbied right now, today, from Zelensky to give them another $100 billion. Most of it military, but a lot of it administrative. That means money laundering. When you hear administrative, that means money laundering. That means it's going directly into the coffers of the oligarchs and the corrupt Ukrainian politicians. Yeah, we can't give them enough money so they can steal it from us. And the war is over, by the way. And even the knot-headed liberals know that. They won't admit it, but they know it. And this is one of the biggest knotheads in the group.
Go to emergency units when they can't go to the dentist. Why is the Honourable Member betraying?
This is the former health minister who said you should be getting a booster shot, COVID booster shot for the rest of your life.
When people are calling for your departure, it's probably not a good idea to go on a trip abroad. And yet, the CEO of Radio Canada, Catherine Tate, who announced the dismissal of 600 Radio Canada employees last Monday, has just left for Australia.
This is a funny
I'm
story.
sure you'll agree, Mr. Speaker, that's quite a lack of judgment.
She just left for Australia.
Does the Minister for Canadian Heritage still have confidence in Catherine Tate? And does she
This is a good question from the block, actually.
To proceed
because Catherine Tate has cut 600 jobs from CBC, but kept the executive bonuses.
Minister for Canadian Heritage.
And $1.3 billion in taxpayer money.
The CEO
now, this is a loser.
CBC Radio Canada. His mandate will come to an end in 2025.
It's going to come to an end forever with the next government.
A selection committee to find the best candidate for her replacement. A replacement for this indispensable organization for Canadian democracy on this side of the
indispensable.
House. It's
history.
That gives services to the Canadian population from coast to coast to coast in French, in English, and Indigenous languages. We'll continue to defend our public.
And Catherine Tate is just the perfect symbol of how elitist and detached the CBC is. It is a complete joke of an organization. It just spends money. I always said when I was Air Force Public Affairs, you could tell the CBC crew because they bring 4 people, one person just to hold the bag of bagels. And it's serious. I'm serious about that. It is an absolutely defunct organization. It always has been. It just sucks up taxpayer dollars, gives a huge salaries to executives, and they are completely worthless in their jobs.
And I would like to first of all commend my colleague for the Bloc Québécois because he has always strongly defended newsrooms throughout our country and democracy in our country. Unfortunately, that is not the case for the Conservatives who are trying to destroy newsrooms. As my colleague knows,
you're buying the newsrooms off.
The Broadcasting Act, which gives the CRTC.
That's all the Liberals are about, is buying reporters.
For our TV and radio journalists who are having a bad time, it must be admitted, the CRTC will also be able to decide whether it would be opportune or not to create a new fund to support newsrooms throughout Canada. We continue to work with the
a new fund to support newsroom. To what? To give you the news you want? To report the news the way you want it reported? Is that what this is about? Obviously. What kind of an idiot wouldn't see it?
They promised an independent public inquiry. That is what victims want. They want this independent public inquiry. But the Liberals backed down yesterday. They proposed a voluntary commission. A voluntary commission does not have the power to force federations or abusers to appear. A voluntary commission does not have the power to demand documents subpoenaed. A voluntary commission does not have the power to clean house, nor does it have the power to force changes within Sports Canada. Why are the Liberals protecting the federations instead of protecting victims?
Can we hazard a guess at that?
Mr. Speaker, yes, we announced a commission on the future.
Well,
of sports
they have a
in
Minister
Canada.
of Sport and Physical Activity.
That comes from victim-centered trauma. We are going to study the future of sports in our country. My absolute priority, Mr. Speaker, are athletes, victims, survivors, and safe sports.
Well, thank you for the kind comment, Earl. It's a great show, Dave. Well, I had the sound off for about 20 seconds, and I got
other premiers
I got it raked over the coals for that. Anyway,
and First Nations are suing this government because of the carbon tax. We have a coast to coast to coast revolt against the carbon tax led by conservatives. And as a result of the carbon tax, 40% of Ontarians, 40% more Ontarians have to use a food bank. This Liberal Prime Minister isn't worth the cost. Will he cancel his plans to quadruple the carbon tax on farmers, families, and First Nations for good?
They are in serious political trouble. The Liberals are in serious political trouble over the carbon tax. And half-wits like this who stand up, wave their hands around, and tell you it's good for you, nobody is believing them anymore.
Last week, we released the emissions reduction plan update for Canada. What it shows is we have far exceeded the Harper target. We raised the target. We will achieve the interim objective in 2026.
So
we
what?
Will achieve the
What does it mean? Nothing.
2030 objective of 40% reduction.
You're achieving objectives that are completely worthless.
Where is his climate plan?
I hope he doesn't have one, because you're wasting all of your life on it.
The only thing they've achieved is 800,000 Ontarians going to the food bank. Now think about that. That would be the third largest city in all of Ontario, completely dependent upon using the food bank to exist. And according to Feed Ontario's CEO, it used to be that having a job meant you didn't have to access a food bank. But after 8 years of these incompetent Liberals, that's the new reality here in Canada. Why do they care so little about Canadians?
Why?
Will they axe the tax so Canadians can feed themselves?
You can have 2 jobs and still have to go to a food bank.
Speaker, if the Conservatives actually
Oh,
do
no, not
care
Jenna.
about supporting
Jenna
families,
Suds.
their actions last week speak differently, and actions speak louder than words, Mr. Speaker. They voted against much-needed investments to increase access to childcare in underserved communities. They voted against moving forward with a framework to create a national school food policy, putting food back into schools for children who need it. Mr. Speaker, they're just not worth the risk.
So then the parents are in the food bank.
The honourable member for Bellechasse-les-Échemins, Lévis.
What a joke.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Quebecers between the ages of 18 and 45 are seeing their dreams shattered because of inflation. 75% of them are postponing and cancelling major projects such as buying a house or having a child. Unfortunately, they can't count on the costly Bloc Liberal coalition, which wants to radically increase the inflationary carbon tax. So life is impossible for them. Will the Prime Minister listen to our demands?
Yes, it's a Liberal Bloc coalition. Liberal NDP Bloc
Quebecers can finally
coalition.
make their dreams come true, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Minister for Fisheries and Oceans. Mr. Speaker, I would like to say that it's particularly painful to see my Conservative colleagues from Quebec show that much voluntary blindness. What they defended at the National Assembly to help victims, women victims of violence, to protect other people, is now apparently taboo under the federal leader. They continue to ignore their values Quebecers and measures that could help Canadians and Quebecers. It's a complete shambles, a complete shame.
The Honourable Member for Belge-Champ, Lévis. We'll see who's turning their back on who. We've learned recently that next year a family of 4 will have to spend an extra $700 on groceries alone. This is the unfortunate consequence of the costly Bloc Liberal coalition and their carbon taxes having a real impact. And this is the largest increase in the price of food in 40 years. Will the Prime Minister finally act so that Quebecers can eat properly, particularly at Christmas? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Quebecers are wondering when, well, this is why they
voted back to the Stone Age, Pablo?
Why did they vote against?
Still can't find a barber. Yeah. I know, it's hard.
Workaround.
It's really hard in Ottawa to find a barber.
What
and you wear that same sweater and jacket at question period every day.
The Honourable Member from Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government voted to recognize missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people as a Canada-wide emergency. The Prime Minister acknowledged it as an ongoing genocide. 4 years after the release of the National Inquiry's 231 calls for justice, how many have they completed? Just 2. At this rate, it will take 462 years to implement all of the calls for justice. When will the Liberals start treating this national emergency with the urgency that it deserves?
The Honourable Minister.
The member for Winnipeg Centre for her question and her continued advocacy, addressing the ongoing violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ+ people is a whole of government approach which requires living up to our moral obligations as a country and the calls to justice. That's why in Budget 2023,
here's this non-entity of a
$125 million to implement the National Action Plan for MMIWG, ensuring accountability by establishing an oversight mechanism and support the National Family and Survivor Circle. We will continue to work with families, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are
get it. Look at that.
The Honourable Member from Timmins,
he says, "What the hell?" So I can't read my script.
For clean water on reserve, but they
make
no mention in the Neskantaga First Nation, which has gone 28 years without access to clean
Charlie,
water.
it's time to retire.
At the same time, the leader of the Conservative
Charlie,
Party
it's time to go.
his caucus to try and cut funding for both the suicide
Time to look into nursing homes,
and
Charlie.
for First Nation clean water. His indifference is deeply disturbing, but it's not surprising. But as for the Liberals, Neskantaga has reached out time and time again.
You're in cahoots with them, Charlie.
To fail the people of Neskantaga First Nation.
Yeah. This is the guy who was applauding. He was applauding the fact that an unvaxxed woman from Alberta could not get an organ transplant and died. He was applauding that. You remember Charlie applauding that? Because he's nuts. And it's time for Charlie to retire from politics. Patty Hadju is holding forth here.
Of the legislation, and we look forward to continuing to hear their perspectives.
The Honourable
Nice dress. Where'd you find that at the Goodwill?
Mr. Speaker, every day approximately 12 people die by suicide in Canada. Each life lost by suicide.
You believe the hypocrisy of raising the suicide issue?
The loss of a loved one,
Liberals are killing people
within communities.
Through suicide.
Last week, I was disappointed to see the Conservatives vote against funding to support the implementation of the new suicide crisis helpline. Can the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions tell us how our government is bringing 988 to Canadians, no matter where they live?
Here's a softball question for the
Honourable Minister.
Who's going to take this? For mental health and addiction.
Being such a strong advocate for mental health.
Yeah,
Mr.
well,
Speaker,
you're not a strong advocate.
All those...
Hey, folks, 4% of deaths in Canada are now a direct result of medical assistance in dying, the Liberal euthanasia program. And these idiots have the nerve, the gall, to stand up and say they're supporting a suicide prevention hotline while they're lining people up to be euthanized to help them commit suicide? What kind of fools do they think we are? They must think we're as big as fools as they are.
Just two costly carbon taxes, driving up the cost of food, fuel, and home heating. But premiers and First Nations across this country are demanding that he axe a carbon tax because they know that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost.
I love it.
They
I
are
love it,
joining
John.
Conservatives in opposing this punitive carbon tax because Canadians can't afford Christmas dinner. Every month, 2 million Canadians are lined up at food banks because they can't afford to feed their families. When he increases taxes on farmers, those numbers get worse. Will the Prime Minister cancel his plans to quadruple the carbon tax on families, First Nations, and farmers?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Oh, they got a parliamentary secretary up in this one.
We should talk about Ukraine as the breadbasket
Oh,
to
talk
the
about
world.
Ukraine.
And what I found
Of course,
interesting, Mr.
directly
Speaker,
related.
that the leader of the opposition said
You
today
joke.
in response to the Prime Minister calling out the Conservatives' vote against Ukraine is
Ah.
he used the term
How stupid do you think we are? Not as stupid as you are.
lands. And Mr. Speaker, that reminded me of something.
Oh, get your phone out.
We will no longer use American military might to construct democracies in faraway lands. Donald Trump said that. Why are
Good. Yeah, we shouldn't be. This is what the Liberals want to do now? They want to build so-called democracies in faraway lands. Yes. What a joke. The war in Ukraine is over. This has nothing to do with the issue that was raised by John Barlow. No. Give billions to Ukraine, and that's going to make it cheaper for Canadians to live.
To farmers is what? $1 billion carbon tax bill in their stocking, quadrupling that carbon tax under the tree. And the gift from the Prime Minister's Liberal loyalists in the Senate is to cancel Bill C-234, preventing a carbon tax carve-out for farmers. When we have 2 million Canadians lined up at a food bank every month, and those numbers only getting worse when you increase taxes on farmers, why was the Prime Minister canceling Christmas instead of canceling this quadrupling of his
We're going to get another answer about give billions to Ukraine, and the cost of living in Canada will immediately go down.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative
Oh
leader
no, Christia!
inadvertently showed his true colors a moment
Oh
ago.
no!
He couldn't
Showed his
bring
true
himself to say
colors.
the word Ukraine. So instead, he dismissively called it a faraway land. You know
Oh,
who notoriously
you
used
know
that
Ukraine
term?
very well, don't you?
Neville Chamberlain.
Your grandfather was a Nazi.
1938.
You know
And he
Ukraine.
infamously described Germany's invasion of Czechoslovakia as a quarrel in a faraway country between people of Union.
Ukraine is not a democracy. You might think you're a school marm, but Ukraine is not a democracy, Christia. It's about time you sort of realize that.
After 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, it's evident Canadians despise the carbon tax. Premiers are suing this government, First Nations are taking the government to court, and people are lined up at food banks because they can't afford this Prime Minister's inflationary carbon tax.
Well, who the hell
This Prime Minister has
can?
ruined Christmas for Canadians by keeping his punitive carbon tax that raises the price of food we buy. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost of the lost hope Canadians should feel around the holidays. So will the Prime Minister cancel his plan to quadruple the tax on families, First Nations, and farmers for good?
Yeah, put yourself into that one. There you go.
I'm sure that as this holiday season approaches, the
skinhead. What's
Conservative
the no-
members in this House thought that Christmas was coming early because it seems that Tucker Carlson is coming to Calgary to host Danielle Smith. And
Good.
that doesn't stop there, Mr. Speaker. It's going to be Rex Murphy, Tucker Carlson, and Conrad Black in Edmonton just after. The question, Mr. Speaker,
Well, maybe you
is,
should
will
go
that
and
member
learn
pay for her
something,
ticket individually,
skinhead.
Or is there a group discount for Conservative MPs?
Well, if it would get you educated, maybe there should be a discount for you, cue ball.
Albertans and stop gaslighting Canadians. Yesterday's CTV reported that basic necessities cost more in Calgary than any other major
That
Canadian
Boissonneau
city.
is
One Calgary said it's
such a
really
moron.
difficult if you're sacrificing your own
What
meals
does
so your children can
Tucker
eat because
Carlson have to do with
prices
this?
are unaffordable, or if you're rationing up things like heat for your home. After 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, families are struggling to meet their basic needs, feed themselves, or heat their homes because of this cruel carbon tax. Will the Prime Minister cancel his carbon tax, or will he continue his plan to ruin
Oh,
Christmas?
this will have something to do with Tucker Carlson. Hey, this is animated. Hey. Stephanie, way to go.
member has clearly found her voice today, but it has been months that she and the Alberta Conservatives have been silent on defending Albertans when it comes to Danielle Smith's risky and reckless approach to taking Albertans out of the CPP. Maybe she agrees with her leader.
It's time to talk about the pension plan, of course.
Foreign land, Mr. Speaker, Ukraine matters to Canadians. It matters to Albertans. It matters to Ukrainian Canadians. They and she should be ashamed.
No, it doesn't matter, actually. Less and less. Canadians are tired of dropping billions into this bottomless pit of Ukraine. Total nonsense.
Movement on the issue of the
That's
$460 million
Canadians
that the federal
care
government
about.
must reimburse Quebecers for asylum seekers.
Not
Yesterday, the minister confirmed that the ball is now in the court of his
lost
colleague,
the
Minister of
war.
Finance. So we're
And will
questioning
not
her
become a
today. There's
member
some
of NATO
information she may
after
not be
all
aware of.
of this
First of all,
nonsense.
asylum seekers are federal responsibility, and yet Quebec takes in 48% of Canada's asylum seekers at the expense of Quebecers with no help from the provinces. In short, we've done all.
Anyway, Boissonneau just is incredible with evading any semblance of answering the question. First, he talks about Ukraine. He talks about Tucker Carlson. He goes back to Ukraine. Then he insists it's got nothing to do with the carbon tax. I don't know how these people sleep at night. I really don't.
To welcome immigrants, particularly those who speak French. Asylum seekers is shared jurisdiction, and that's why we work together, because it's a challenge for all our societies in Western worlds, Canada and Quebec.
So you see, he's going to impose a so-called immigration cap, but it's not coming for 3 more years. And the immigration cap is at 500,000 a year. And that doesn't include the illegals and the refugees who sneak across the border. That's legal immigration, which is about twice as much as it should be. The mass immigration is destroying the country because it's too much too soon. And we don't have jobs. We don't have housing to accommodate these people. And we know that. The Liberals know that. They know that.
Allow the bloc the time to protest. I think they can also listen to my answer as well. First, I'd like to thank the member for the efforts to reformulate his question. I'll give them the same answer since while we're at it. Quebec does not just write a blank check to provinces. We have reasonable conversations, and I look forward to having future conversations. Thank you.
From Cumberland, Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, Canadian premiers and First Nations are suing the federal government over their unjust carbon tax, and Canadians cannot afford to eat, heat, or house themselves. After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, indeed, it is a weary world. Back home, there are over 1,800 people on the roster for our local food bank, and over 2 million Canadians across this great country are visiting their local food banks so they can afford to eat. The Prime Minister is not worth the cost. On behalf of all Canadians, will the Prime Minister cancel his plan to quadruple his tax on families, First Nations, and farmers?
I think we're going to go down on the ship with this carbon tax.
Interesting that the member opposite brings up the misery in the world, and part of that is what Ukrainians are facing right now, defending their democracy.
It's got everything to do with Ukraine. Let me get my phone out. Let me get my phone out again.
American military might to construct democracies in faraway lands, or try
we already heard you read that one.
Other countries in our own image.
You want to spend billions more on other faraway lands?
Conservatives vote against Canada-Ukraine free trade agreement because they are taking their lessons from Donald Trump and don't support the rebuilding of Ukraine and democracies around this world.
Well, I hope they're taking their lessons from Donald Trump, but they're probably not. As brainless an answer as that was.
That member, Canadians have never had it so good. Sadly, every day we hear from Canadians who are selling their homes because they cannot afford their mortgages, who are visiting food banks because they cannot afford to eat, and who are spending most of the day in bed with the covers pulled up because they cannot afford home heating fuel. After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, this is the situation for Canadians in our great country. This Prime Minister and that member is not worth the cost. Once again, on behalf of all Canadians, will the Prime Minister cancel his plan to quadruple the tax on families, First Nations, and farmers forever?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker, you know, I'd love to see another member from Atlantic Canada
Just vote Liberal. Gertie or Goody? Goody. Goody Hutchins. Just vote Liberal.
Does he not realize that that's jobs? That's communities. That was 95.
Do you not realize you're a joke? No.
With over $16 million, that's in jobs, growing the economy. That's putting food on people's table.
The answer to all your problems is to just vote Liberal.
Business, we support people and help them through these
Did you not see my interview?
The honourable member from Costa Bay Central, Notre Dame.
Or live in Atlantic Canada.
She supports seals and rivers. She didn't vote for C-251. You know what, Mr. Speaker? Food bank usage at Memorial University in St. John's has nearly tripled since last year. Groceries have increased. Students and families can't afford them, thanks to carbon tax. Christmas is not far away, and many folks can't afford Christmas dinner this year. After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government is not worth the cost. So will the Prime Minister cancel his plan to quadruple tax on families, First Nations, and farmers?
Yeah,
Honourable Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Oh, no. This is comic. It's comedy time.
Voted against all agricultural programs last Thursday evening. But again, they
You can remember that far back?
on how they feel about Atlantic
Lawrence,
Canada
that's pretty
and Prince
good.
Edward Island. When they voted against the funding for the replacement vessel for the Wood Islands Caribou Ferry Service, a vital link between Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. I can assure Prince Edward Islanders and Nova Scotians that this government will continue to support a two-vessel system for that vitally important service. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
He forgot all about the forest fires today.
Member from Châteauguay-Lacolle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Is for Christy.
The government has a plan for the middle
So she can
class
start shaking her
services
hand
and
at
programs
me?
for our country. Last week, the Conservatives tried to cut programs, and they showed their true colors by voting against programs and services that all Canadians depend on.
Watch, Christy will be up in a minute. Thank you very much for that.
The Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, can she tell Canadians about our plan? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Conservatives showed their true colors. For 24 hours, the Conservative leader and his entire party voted in favor of cutting our plan to support and grow the middle class. They voted against the Canadian Dental Care Plan.
They voted against out of that suit.
Building houses. They voted against funding our child care plan for $10 a day. And they even voted against
from Cypress Hills Grasslands.
No, didn't get to finish the monologue.
NDP government, the cost of taking over the family farm is becoming insurmountable. A family in Elrose passed their family farm down to the next generation. And over the last year, the carbon tax on natural gas alone has cost this young family over $3,000. And the Prime Minister's Christmas gift to them is to quadruple the carbon tax. This is just insane. Since the Prime Minister won't axe the tax before Christmas, does he truly believe a new generation of farmers should pay these ridiculous costs, or has making farming unaffordable been his goal all along?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, are we meant to believe that the other side of the House, in their zeal to vote against a carbon tax that they see as harming farmers, that they would vote against all funding for Canada's poultry, egg, and dairy farmers? Is that a way to support farmers? Is the way to support First Nations to cut all housing for new housing on reserve for First Nations? Is a way to help families to cut affordable child care and affordable dental care? No one believes them, Mr. Speaker. No one believes them.
There's the co-star of the Trudeau heat pump video, Seamus O'Regan. He kind of stood there and looked embarrassed.
Canadians are shouldering the weight of this NDP Liberal government's costly carbon tax. Every gift under the tree, every family visit, and every meal prepared will come at an additional cost. The Prime Minister's punishing carbon tax is ruining Christmas. After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canadian families are tired of making the unimaginable sacrifices. This NDP Liberal government is not worth the cost. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister allow his heart to grow 3 sizes and axe the carbon tax on families, First Nations, and farmers?
I'm sure the Prime Minister's already skipped out of there.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question from my honourable colleague, but Canadians have some questions for that party after their leader's $2 million temper tantrum last week. So those questions include, since an average family of 4 in Ontario receives more than $300 back from the Climate Action Incentive, why are the Conservatives so hell-bent on taking money out of lower and middle-income Canadian families? The second question is, why are they so hell-bent on betraying Ukraine, Mr. Speaker? And my third question,
Ukraine had to come up again.
Lloydminster, is why is she so against the 5 farms in her riding that received over $120,000 in climate action rebates?
Yeah, and spent $450,000 to get that.
Mr. Speaker, the CEO of CBC is completely out of touch. A month ago, she hired a Paris firm to translate a podcast instead of hiring Quebecers because she didn't like the Quebec accent. Now, when hundreds of employees are wondering if they still have a job after Christmas, she decides it's time to go have some fun in Australia. Does the minister...
Oh, that is incredible. She skipped the country
because she
didn't want to appear before the committee.
The CBC CEO, Catherine Tate, to run Radio Canada.
I wouldn't trust her to run a hotel.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his question because it allows me to remind everyone here in this chamber and all Quebecers that the last time the Conservative Party was in power, they made cuts to CBC Radio Canada.
Well, the next time they're going to defund it entirely. And people like you are going to lose your job.
Destroy CBC now, even saying that it was as if it were doable. The Conservatives can say whatever they want. They no longer want a public broadcaster. They want to undermine Canadian democracy. It's shameful.
What does CBC have to do with Canadian democracy? What an airhead. Complete airhead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that governments that have strong representation by women and strong women leaders invest more in people. And so, just last week, we saw the Conservatives, whose caucus is only 17% women.
You can see they handed her the question before she got there. Right? In the green file folder.
In Canadians. In fact, they voted 120 times no to investing in Canadians.
She's been rehearsing that for the last half hour in the back room.
How these reckless Conservatives would have greatly hurt the very Canadians we are working so hard to support.
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Yeah, you did a great job.
Last week, parliamentarians voted on 120 measures to support Canadians, especially vulnerable Canadians. These included supports to the Canadian Armed Forces, supports for families for affordable childcare, as well as supports for more affordable housing. Canadians deserve opportunities to succeed. Yet on 120 occasions, Conservatives voted against Canadians. We will stand shoulder to shoulder with Canadians.
The package also included evidence
Edmonton will live in unsuitable housing.
Sorry, I'm trying to find you something here.
This government's failure to build affordable homes. Corporate Conservatives and delay Liberals continue to play cover for rich developers and billionaires as they renovate my constituents. Last year, 156 people died in Edmonton because they were homeless. Deaths that could have been prevented had the government acted sooner. So again, when will the government get the money out the door to build social and co-op housing now?
I'm going to ask the honourable member from Battle River, Crowfoot, please, to wait his turn to ask a question. The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Oh, he had to get up once today to start waving his arms around.
To continue to invest in affordable housing, including cooperative housing. I would point him to the recent fall economic statement, which increased grant funding to cooperative housing by more than $300 million, and we will be rolling out a program worth more than $1.5 billion beginning early in the new year. Mr. Speaker, I do agree with him on one point of his question, however. however, the Conservatives' dedication to opposing funding for affordable housing. In fact, just last week, when they had an opportunity to put their position on the record in this chamber, they voted against supports for affordable housing. They voted against emergency
Saxon
transition
Steele,
shelters for women and children,
WEF
and
Young
they
Leader
voted against
Fraser.
supports for
You
veterans
betcha.
living through homelessness. Mr. Speaker, it's the wrong.
The honourable member from Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Must be a dipper.
More than 800,000 herring were killed because of open net fish farm activity. Now, the BC Premier says the social...
I'm going to interrupt the member from Nanaimo Ladysmith because we can't hear her in the House. We can? So I'll just ask you to start again from the top.
Yeah, we
The
could,
honourable
actually.
Member from Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Open net fish farms pollute our waters and impact food security. In 2022 alone, more than 800,000 herring were killed because of open net fish farm activity. Now, the BC Premier says the social license for these fish farms has expired. The Liberals promised to get these farms out of the water by 2025 with a real jobs plan, yet so far, nothing. So I will ask again, where is the plan so that coastal communities, workers, and First Nations are not left behind?
The Honourable Minister for l'Honorable Ministre des Pêches et Océans.
The Honourable Minister for Fisheries and Oceans.
Oh, she got another chance to stand up today.
Responsible transition plan for open net aquaculture. We continue to work on a transition plan that protects Pacific salmon while providing support to workers and their communities and enhancing reconciliation. Fishery and Oceans
wouldn't want to run into her on a foggy night.
Continue to have constructive conversations with stakeholders regarding
down on the
next steps.
fisheries dock. You scared the hell of it back into the ocean. Anyway, that was wonderful. Oh, love it.
The honourable member.
Anyway, I've got a real treat for you here. If you missed the video earlier, this is the committee that's investigating Greg Fergus and whether or not he should stay on as Speaker because of the video he did in support of the interim Liberal leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, John Fraser. Put a video together wearing his robes in his office saying what a wonderful guy he was and how wonderful it was to elect Dalton McGuinty. And he also, the following day, was going on about some guy named Klaus, who he originally thought was Klaus Schwab. Turns out it was another Liberal. And he was saying that he was a former leader of the Young Liberals. So once again, advertising, he can't stop advertising the fact he's a Young Liberal. He was a Young Liberal, and he's a proud member of the Liberal Party. So is this guy capable of being Speaker of the House where he's supposed to be nonpartisan? Watch what the Liberals did on this committee to convince people that Greg Fergus has this overwhelming support out there.
Mr. Speaker, you're probably not aware of that, but late last night, many members of PROC received letters supporting you in your role as Speaker.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Duncan.
Wondering, just in reference to Ms. Romanato's comments about, she referenced some emails that we received last night, including to members of PROC's personal parliamentary emails. I'm looking for unanimous consent if I could table those two letters that were provided to us by email last night, and also including in that a copy of the metadata from both of those. When you open up the Microsoft Word document, you can actually go and see who the original authors of those two were. I'd like to table not only the letters, but along with each, that the author of the one letter dated yesterday came from a Liberal appointed senator, Senator Andrew Cardozo. And I'd also in the second letter like to table not only the letter, but the metadata that shows that the author of that original letter was a former Liberal member of Parliament, Frank Bayless.
Interesting, that's possible. So there you go. Now, they got a Liberal appointed senator and a former Liberal MP to write these anonymous letters supporting Greg Fergus. What a great guy he is. We just love him so much. Of course, they're phony. They're fraudulent letters. What else are they up to? Yes, lots of it. So, and apparently the former Liberal MP has been embroiled in an ethical scandal going back to COVID days where he was supposed to produce ventilators, and it looks like it was a dummy corporation that didn't deliver much or at all. We're looking into that one. Let's see what else we can come up with. But if you want to look for further into it, see the X post by this Conservative MP and look directly below it. There's all kinds of social media comment about this former Liberal MP and the ventilators. Worth looking into. I want to share one final video, and this is the green energy scam that's going on as well. Have a look at this.
Of the toxic workplace culture that was created by CEO Leah Lawrence and her friend and still current VP Zoe Kolbuck, who've been allowed to continue abusing and harassing employees by a passive senior management team and board that protects and hides the abuse. All of this information underwent review by PCO and was then forwarded to ISED, who subsequently engaged RCGT to conduct an independent fact-finding exercise to validate this information. Here are the findings for everyone. The Seed Fund, Ecosystem Fund, and Scale Up Fund were all found to be ineligible due to multiple violations of the contribution agreement, significant deviations from the due diligence process, and conflict of
There's a blur because he's a whistleblower. If anyone's wondering there, and I see I have angry Canadians. Why the blur? That's why. I'm not sure it's very effective blur because I can probably identify the guy, but that's why.
Interest breaches by board members and executives. This finding encompasses nearly 200 companies that all received over $80 million, all of which was improperly funded using taxpayer money. The two COVID payments in 2020 and 2021 were also given to the full portfolio of companies and totaled almost $40 million, and were also deemed to be ineligible as the use of these funds was not effectively tracked. And several board members in that instance also violated conflict of interest by approving almost $4 million to themselves to over a dozen companies where they all hold significant ownership or executive positions.
So, very interesting. I want to point out I've also put in the comments section, I have put in the link to the non-confidence petition that a Conservative MP for Ferrari has put up. So I would encourage you to sign that petition because we have got to find a way around the next 2 years and Justin Trudeau in power. He is not, it's not just that he's not worth the cost. He is a catastrophe for Canada and Canadians. It's not just the economy either. He's destroying our basic liberties, destroying our freedom of speech, destroying our freedom of assembly, our right to protest. He is destroying Canada as we know it. I encourage you to please sign that petition. And stay tuned on this green scam here. This is fascinating. But here's a whistleblower talking about it, and you're getting no answers from the Liberal government, no answers from Justin Trudeau, and nothing from Champagne, the industry minister who's behind it all, who just keeps waving his hand and screeching at the top of his lungs that it's all about Ukraine, as they all do. Liberals can only talk about two things right now: Ukraine and climate change. Everything goes back to that. Or Alberta pension plan when they have nothing else to reach for. So that's what question period has become. I think you're getting more answers as you talk amongst yourselves, to me, to other commentators, to other people who are commenting on the broadcast. Thanks for joining me today. Thanks for being a part of this. And we'll be back again tomorrow. Because as I told you last week, the Freedom Convoy trial has been recessed until mid-March, the Ides of March. And if you haven't seen my interview with Tamara Leach, I talked to her on Friday. The broadcast is up on the Stand on Guard. It's the last one I did prior to today's. And I encourage you to watch that. Fascinating interview with Tamara. And she talks about what it's been like to be punished by the judicial system for protesting Justin Trudeau's policies. Very interesting. Thanks for watching today. And We will be back again tomorrow with more. Bye for now.